This video is sponsored by NewAir.
Shall we begin?
I try to do a shop tour once every 3 years, and the last time I did one of these was in 2015, so it's about time for another one. So what I wanted to do in this video is just kind of walk you guys around my shop and maybe point out some of the upgrades since the last tour, and maybe talk about some of the things I like about my shop and also some of the things that I don't like. And hopefully this tour will give you some ideas for your shop. Because my wood shop is in a 2-car garage, it can get a little bit warm out here during the summer months. So this year I wanted to try getting a AC unit out here. And originally I was thinking about getting a window unit, but my wife didn't want the window unit to be visible from the outside. She thought it would look kind of unsightly. So I opted for a freestanding AC unit, and I got this one from NewAir. There really wasn't much to the installation for this unit. All you have to do is connect this hose, which is included, to this window adapter so that it can exhaust the hot air to the outside. And then once you turn the unit on, you can dial it down to the temperature that you want to cool your shop down to, and then you're all set. And it cools my shop down really nicely. And what I also like about this is it also dehumidifies the air, and it collects the water down at the bottom of the unit, and there's a drain in the back that you just unscrew a little knob and you can drain it out into a pan, and it works out really cool. I also really like that the unit's on wheels, so if you need to move it around a little bit, you can with no problem. Use promo code GARAGE to get 20% off at the link down below. At the very front of my shop, I have my bandsaw, my router table, disc sander, and my drum sander. And the bandsaw was actually the first tool that I got which required me to wire my shop for 220. And it's this same circuit that's also used to power my table saw, my drum sander, and my new joiner. So I think maybe down the road I'm going to install either a second or a third 220 volt circuit. My bandsaw is an 18-inch bandsaw, and I think this is the perfect size for the kind of work that I do in my shop. I really haven't had a need for a bandsaw any larger than this, so this has been working out really well. One thing that I am going to have to do is that because I will have the garage door shut most of the summer, because I now have an AC unit, when I'm cutting boards that are really long, I'm going to have to temporarily open the garage door and then just shut it again. I don't suspect it'll be a huge problem, but we'll see. One thing that I do want to do with this bandsaw is eventually get it hooked up to dust collection, because the way it is now, I've just been running it and letting the sawdust go onto the floor, and then I'll just vacuum it up later. But during the summer, when I'm going to have the garage door shut, I think in order to keep this air a lot cleaner in the wood shop, I'm going to eventually have to hook this up to dust collection. In this bin, I keep cutoffs that are too short to put back onto the lumber rack, and I'll just pick through this when I need something really small, like something for tenant stock, for example. I'll just pick through here. And in this bin, I keep all of the wood that I just plan on burning. I don't have any use for it. It's just stuff that's really small or just junk. So this will eventually get dragged into the backyard, and it'll get burned every once in a while. And as you can see, it's starting to overflow, so it's time for another fire. In this blue bin, which is kind of hard to see, I will store cutoffs from 8-quarter boards and 12-quarter boards, which I plan on using over at the lathe. Right in front of the blue bin and green bin is my very first table saw that I bought probably close to 16 years ago. And I've held on to it ever since, and I'm glad I did, because I use it for a lot of different things now. I use it to hold my router table in the old extension wing on the right side of the table saw. And what I like about using a table saw for this is that I can use the table saw rip fence to hold my router table fence. So I can move this whole thing forward and back and then lock it down, and this works out really well. I haven't had any issues. And on the left side of it, where the main portion of the table saw, I removed the table saw blade, and I installed a metal disc, and on each side of the metal disc, I have 2 different grits of sandpaper, which is an adhesive-backed sandpaper. So on one side, I have 80 grit, and on the other side, I have 150 grit. So depending on the work that I'm doing, I can sand on one side of the disc or on the other. And this also works out really well. One thing though, that because it's running off of a table saw, the disc tends to spin really fast. And if you're not careful, you can end up removing a lot of wood really quick. So you have to be very careful and move the workpiece in a very controlled fashion. Otherwise, you can really damage it by removing too much material. One thing that I recently did that I really like is that I hooked the backside of my router table fence up to dust collection. I took a piece of PVC and I cut out a notch, and this piece of PVC is screwed to the backside of the router table fence, and then I have a 90-degree elbow which is hooked up to my shop vac. One disadvantage to the way I have this hooked up is that if I want to tilt my router table fence, I just need to remove this piece of PVC. In front of my router table is my 16-inch Grizzly drum sander. Now, I don't use this tool a whole lot, but it's one of those tools that's nice to have because, well, there might be another tool that can do the job, but this one does it a lot nicer usually and a lot faster. And much like my bandsaw, when this is in use, I have to have the garage door open because there just isn't enough room to feed the material through. Now, when this is in use, I will have it hooked up to my shop vac. But I will say that the shop vac is severely underpowered for this drum sander. It doesn't do a good enough a job of getting all of the dust out. So I think an upgrade for my shop in the future might be a decent sized dust collector. On the right wall of my wood shop is my lumber rack. And this is actually one of the first things that I made in my wood shop to store all of my lumber. And it's made from plywood and 2x4s, and the 2x4s in the back are secured to the studs in the wall with lag screws, and it's really pretty stable. And when I originally made this, the idea was to separate the different species of wood on different shelves. But over the years, that didn't really seem to pan out. I just have different species mixed all over the place. So this is actually in need of organization right now. Just in front of the lumber rack is where I have my original 6-inch joiner and my new Grizzly 8-inch joiner. And when I positioned these joiners, I made sure that there's no obstruction to the front of the wood shop. For example, on the outfeed side of the Grizzly joiner, I should be able to clear the drum sander on the right-hand side. And the 6-inch joiner, I should also be able to clear the drum sander on the left-hand side. But I think I'm going to eventually get rid of my 6-inch joiner because now that I have the big 8-inch, I don't think there's really any need to hang on to this anymore. So I'm probably going to be getting rid of this guy in the future. I should point out that around the floor of my wood shop in key areas, I have these thick rubber mats placed down. And these are really useful because they're really helpful when you're walking around because it makes it easier on your feet. And they're also nice to have when you drop tools on the ground, for chisels, for example. And I can't tell you how many tools these rubber mats have saved. In the center of my shop is my table saw and my giant outfeed table. Now, there's really not a whole lot to say about my table saw other than it's hooked up to a Dust Deputy Cyclone and a shop vac, and that seems to do really well for this table saw. I don't have any major issues with dust with my table saw. Now, the outfeed table is a good size. It's 4 feet wide by almost 6 feet long. And I really like having this big outfeed table most of the time. It's nice for doing assemblies because I have a huge work surface to work off of for doing glue ups, and that's really nice. But it is really big and it does take up a lot of space, and when you're in a small garage wood shop like this, it's taking up space that maybe could be devoted to another power tool, for example, or just something else in general. But I think for now I'm going to stick with this big outfeed table, but maybe down the road there is a possibility that I could downsize this to something a little smaller. So other than serving as an assembly table and an outfeed table for my table saw, this surface also serves as an outfeed table for my planer. And it also holds a twin screw vise on that side of the table, and it also has an end vise on this side. And I have dog holes running down the length of the outfeed table that I use to clamp down work to this surface. And that works out really nice. So this table does a lot of different things in this wood shop. So I just wanted to real quickly show you guys how I service the dust collection to my table saw and my planer. I have the dust port in the back of the table saw connected to this flexible hose, which is connected to this PVC Y adapter. I don't know what it's called, that's what I call it. And this is connected directly to my Dust Deputy Shop Vac Cyclone. And like I said, it pulls the dust out of the table saw really nicely, and there's not been any issue. Now originally I had this as a Y adapter because I had the dust port for the planer hooked up on this side of the Y. And what I found was that as the planer was running, the blower on the planer was so strong that it was actually blowing chips into the cabinet of the table saw instead of going into the bucket of the Dust Deputy Cyclone. So what I ended up doing was taping off this part of the Y adapter, and every time I want to use my planer, I have to unhook the dust collection from the table saw and hook it up to the port on the planer. One thing I thought about doing to fix this problem that should work is to make a gate, one on each port of the Y, and depending on which tool I'm using, I can either open or close the gate, and that should solve the problem of the blower from the planer blowing chips into the cabinet of the table saw. But I never got around to doing it, so it's in the queue, let's say that, it's in the queue. On this wall, just in front of my planer, I have my parallel clamp rack, and this is where I store all of my parallel clamps, obviously. And further down, I have storage for my bar clamps, just out of your view. And on top of my parallel clamp rack, I have storage for different jigs, and this is where I also keep a lot of my micro jig grippers on the very top. And just in front of the clamps, I have my Laguna Lathe, and I love this lathe. I haven't had it for very long, maybe a couple of years now, but I really enjoy using it. And this is another tool that requires 220 volt circuit. So this tool will share the same 220 volt circuit as the bandsaw, the table saw, the drum sander, and now my Grizzly joiner. So like I said before, I'm probably going to install at least one more 220 volt circuit. Just in front of my planer and next to my lathe is my floor standing drill press. And I bought this drill press to replace a benchtop drill press which broke a few years back. And on my old drill press, in order to change the speed of the chuck, you could just turn a dial on the front to get the speed that you liked. And that one was really nice to use. This one's a little bit more of a pain to get the speed that you'd like for the chuck. You have to open up the top, and there are two belts and different pulleys, and depending on the combination that you have set for the different pulleys and the belts, that will get you the speed. And on the inside of the drill press, there's a little table that tells you which combination of belts and pulleys you need in order to get that speed. It works okay, it's just not as nice to use as my old one. And next to my drill press, I have a cabinet which holds all of my router bits. And if you'd like to make this router bit storage cabinet thingy, I'll have a link in the video description below. And this has also been working out really well. And on top of that, I have a little shelf, and I store drill bits and also my handheld drill. The router bits in this storage system are actually arranged by type. And this makes it a lot nicer when you're looking for a particular router bit. You know which section of the router bit storage system to look in order to find it. And when I made this system, I made it so that the individual router bit holders are adjustable in their position. And this made it a lot easier to arrange. In the very back of the wood shop is my horizontal mortiser and another workbench. And this bench holds a lot of different tools. It's a nice place to hold my handheld routers on the far left-hand side of the bench. It stores all of my hand planes, and it's also a nice place to store my chisel rack. There's also space for my bench grinder, my oscillating spindle sander, and my Bosch miter saw. Now, when I use this miter saw, sometimes on the left-hand side of the bench, there might be stuff that gets in the way of whatever I'm chopping. So I think down the road, one of the things I'm gonna make is a freestanding miter saw station where I'll have plenty more room on either side of the miter saw to work. On the far right side of the bench is where I keep my Dovetail Jig. And this is one of those tools that doesn't see a whole lot of use, but it's nice to have when you really need it. And in this section over here is where I do a lot of the aligning for my alignment jigs. I have a small size granite surface plate under here, And under this one, I have a much larger granite surface plate. And those come in really handy for aligning tools. And in this box, I keep my fat edge squares that I use for aligning power tools. And I also keep in here razor blades, and I also keep the chisels for my rabbiting plane. I like to keep them in here because they do have a tendency to rust. So in order to slow down the rusting process, I keep a paper towel in the bottom of the box, and I'll spray this with WD-40, and then when I close the box, the oil will kind of evaporate a little bit, and it'll create a oil vapor in the headspace of the box, and that really seems to slow down the rusting process. And on the back wall of the shop is where I store my limited collection of handsaws. Under my workbench, I have a shelf where I keep a lot of the jigs I use for sharpening, and I also have some glue applicators, and I also keep my pumice all the way in the back. Further down to the right, underneath the bench, I have another shelf where I keep mostly finishing supplies, and I also store my glues down here. Well, I hope I at least gave you a few ideas of things you might want to try in your shop, and maybe I also gave you a few ideas of things not to try in your shop. Either way. If you have any suggestions for me that you think might be improvements in my shop, let me know in the comment section below. And also don't forget you can use discount code GARAGE to get 20% off of your own NewAir portable AC unit. And you'll find a link to the unit in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.